here with Dr. Wenzel Leff, author of Traveling Without a Spare, A Survivor's Guide to Navigating the Post-Polio Journey. How are you doing, Dr. Leff?
Fine, thank you.
As a polio survivor yourself and a retired physician, you must know a thing or two about polio.
I would hope so.
In Traveling Without a Spare, you begin with a personal story of your experience with the disease. Can you tell us a little bit about that? I believe you were 16 years old when you contracted the virus.
Yes, this was in Mobridge, South Dakota. I was living with my family, and I had a job as an electrician's assistant. I had just finished my day's work and had gone out cruising Main Street with my friends. Pretty soon I became a little on the ill side, and I said to my friends, "Take me home."
So how long was it before you realized that the reason you were feeling lousy was actually polio?
Well, the next morning I was feeling worse, and my parents took me to the medical clinic, and I was examined by two young physicians who elected to do a spinal tap on me. The fluid came back with protein and cells, and they told my parents, "Your son has polio."
So in 1949, when you were diagnosed with polio, the disease was really top of mind in the United States.
That's correct.
Were you the only one in your town to contract polio?
I was one of 14 that contracted polio. The town was of only 4,000 people, and so that was a high concentration of polio at the time. Everyone was scared to death.
And you were diagnosed and then admitted to St. Luke's in Aberdeen, South Dakota, 100 miles away from your hometown. Can you tell us a little bit about your time at St. Luke's?
Well, I spent quite a bit of time there, but starting out, I had flu-like symptoms. They persisted and progressed for about 4 days, and then I woke up and my legs were paralyzed. I couldn't move them. The doctors told someone that the nurses or my parents that they thought that I would never walk again, may never walk again.
So you remained paralyzed, I know from the book, for about 4 months?
That's correct.
But in fact, you did regain the use of your legs and were essentially able to walk unaided for the next several decades.
That's correct.
You were in the hospital for 4.5 months before you were able to return home. What was that like coming home?
Well, for some people it wasn't a very happy experience, but for me it was a very joyous experience. I was well accepted by my friends, well accepted by the community, and almost celebrated. And I guess part of that was because people in Mobridge had known about polio, or by this time had learned about polio, so they weren't worried about their kids catching polio from me. And so I was free to move, so to speak, and I had a good time.
And aside from the residual weakness in your legs, were there any other physical challenges or limitations that you had to work with?
Oh, there were lots of them. Academically, probably the biggest one was in typing. There was difficulty with my hands. My right hand was quite normal and moved rather rapidly. My left hand was dragging behind. And so when I would type 2 as OT and such, so that I had difficulty that way. But by the end of the semester, I was able to manage my 36 words per minute and pass the class. I'm still not a good typist.
Anything else? Any other issues or challenges?
It was obvious that I wasn't going to be able to be a jock. I couldn't run, I couldn't jump. I liked music, and so I concentrated more on music and student politics. In the band, I couldn't march with the rest of the band, so I was student band director, and so I was able to walk along or march along the side of the band, and it didn't make any difference whether I was out of step or not. So that ended up being a positive experience for me. The things I really enjoyed, I loved dance, and I could dance no more. I went to that first dance and tried to shuffle around. It was obvious I could no longer do my jitterbuggy and whatever everyone else was doing at the time. I still miss dancing to this very day.
And then you were off to college and eventually med school.
That's correct. I went to Yankton College in Yankton, South Dakota for my undergraduate degree. It was there that I met my wife, and the two of us then went to the University of South Dakota, where I got my master's in medicine, and then on to Washington University in St. Louis for my doctorates.
Was becoming a doctor always part of your plan?
Well, I wouldn't say that it was always, as a young boy, you're wanting to be a fireman or you want to be a policeman or something like that. But as I matured a bit and as I had spent time in the hospital becoming acquainted with medicine and the character of people that were in medicine and their dedication, I thought that that would be a great challenge. And then from then on, I was quite interested in medicine.
Did you ever consider making polio research part of your medical career?
No, not seriously. In medical school, I had a couple of professors that wanted me to go in or suggested that I go into rehabilitation type medicine and with the idea of taking care of polio patients. Because of my experience with polio, I wasn't excited about that because I thought polio was over. And I thought that internal medicine would be the place for me.
You really did not want to be defined by your polio at this point.
No, and I don't think any of us really wanted to be defined by our polio.
You described that around the start of medical school, some 6 years after you contracted the initial virus, that you reached what you called the point of maximum recovery, which marked the beginning of your stable stage.
That's correct.
So before we go on, let's take a moment and talk about those 4 stages of polio. A lot of feedback from readers, and especially those who are polio survivors, is how much they appreciate how, as a doctor, you're able to describe the science of what was going on with their bodies.
The polio experience may be divided clinically into 4 stages: the acute stage, the recovery stage, the stable stage, and post-polio. Of the stages of paralytic polio, the acute or infectious stage is clearly the most dramatic, essentially a fight to the finish between the poliovirus and the body's immune system. It begins with the body's first exposure to the virus and ends only when one side can declare victory. The recovery stage begins when the last of the virus is arrested and destroyed and ends months or years later when the polio patient stabilizes, having reached a point of maximum improvement. The stable stage is the period between the point of maximum recovery and the point at which the polio survivor has accumulated sufficient symptoms that his or her post-polio impacts are influencing daily life. The 4th stage, post-polio, is in many ways the culmination of the first 3 stages in combination with the natural effects of aging. This might be best understood by looking at the nerve changes that occurred at each of those stages. First, let's get our bearings with a before picture. The striated surface on the bottom right represents muscle fibers. At the top left, we see a cross-section of the spinal cord with motor nerves emerging from it, extending to the muscle. Muscle movement is achieved through the process of innervation, whereby impulses are sent from the brain down the spinal cord and transmitted through the motor nerves out to muscles. Each of the 2 nerves in this illustration has multiple branches called axons that end in footpads through which the impulses are transmitted. Now the poliovirus has appeared on the scene. This is the acute stage, and the polio battle is in full swing. In our illustration, the lower motor nerve is infected by the poliovirus and appears to be disintegrating. If the nerve fails, its branches and footpads will fail too. At the end of the acute stage, the battle is over, the poliovirus is gone, but the damage remains. The infected lower nerve has disappeared, and its branches and footpads have failed and are disintegrating as well. The muscle fibers that the lower nerve supplied have been orphaned. The muscle is now paralyzed. In contrast, the upper nerve escaped infection and is still healthy and functional. During the recovery stage, we observe the amazing process of reinnervation of the paralyzed muscle. From the surviving healthy nerve, new axons, or nerve branches, sprout and grow to replace the axons that disappeared. The new axon sprouts reach out to adopt and innervate orphaned muscle fibers, reestablishing some degree of function to paralyzed muscle. Reinnervation, while somewhat miraculous, is often an imperfect process. By counting the number of new axon sprouts and foot pads, for example, we see that the workload of this surviving nerve has more than doubled. Some surviving nerves take on many times their original workload. Dr. Leff points out that stable stage is something of a misnomer, as it is not truly stable. As they age, polio survivors experience the same subtle wear and tear on all parts of their bodies, including their neuromuscular systems, that all humans do. This is an ongoing and decidedly unstable process. The nerve regeneration of the recovery stage was an inherently make-do process. We can see that the resulting axons are often less sturdy than those they replaced. Moreover, if the surviving nerve in our illustration doubled its workload at the time of reinnervation, it is also likely to suffer twice as much wear and tear from everyday use during the so-called stable stage. So now we see the accumulated deterioration of the regenerated nerves in the lower portion of our illustration, leaving the muscle once again without a nerve supply. This second loss of innervation leads to the stage that polio survivors experience as post-polio. The post-polio stage is evidence of this loss becoming overt, manifested clinically by a progression of weakness, fatigue, pain, and other symptoms.
When you reached your point of maximum recovery, which marks the beginning of the stable stage, you say in the book that you felt as though you had fought the fight, had recovered, and didn't anticipate that there would be another stage to deal with.
That's correct.
So when was it that you first realized you were not truly stable and that you had entered into a fourth post-polio stage?
That's kind of a hard question to answer. It's difficult to put a exact time on it. But I can say that by the time I was 50 years of age, I began noticing weakness in my left leg to the point of considering and obtaining a brace for that leg.
And did you wear that brace pretty much all the time when you were up on your feet?
Yes, all the time.
And then the post-polio symptoms, the muscle fatigue and weakness, pain, tiredness, those continued to progress. So how did you respond to these new physical challenges?
Well, very shortly, I needed a brace on my right leg as well. And then I started using crutches when I was walking a long distance. I started using handrails. I got using scooters and the like.
Let's talk for a minute about the title of your book, Traveling Without a Spare, because the title is a reference to a key explanation for post-polio. Is that right?
It refers to the loss of neuromuscular reserves that occurred during the time of our initial infection. We are all born with quite an arsenal of backup tissue and organs. For example, we have 2 kidneys, but can get along quite nicely with just one. We have 2 lungs, but in a pinch, one will suffice. The same is true of neuromuscular mass. Neuromuscular mass refers to the muscle fibers that are innervated by motor nerves. Innervation is what makes the muscles function. Human beings are born with about twice as much neuromuscular mass as they need. So, like the second kidney and the second lung, the second half of our neuromuscular mass is our reserve. For most people, this neuromuscular reserve comes in handy when they begin to experience the natural loss that comes with aging. The natural attrition of age usually becomes noticeable around 50 years of age and continues through life. At about 80 years of age, most people will have lost 50% of their functional neuromuscular mass. In other words, they've used up their reserves and have just enough to get by. But with paralytic polio, we lost a good deal of neuromuscular mass at the time of our original infection, essentially depleting our reserves. So when we polio people begin to experience the natural attrition of age, we don't have the backup neuromuscular mass that our non-polio peers are able to rely on as they move from age 50 to 80. We are essentially traveling without a spare.
Well, the first part of your book describes your personal story, The Science of the Polio Infection and the Body's Response. The second half of the book is really about post-polio. You start by describing what you refer to as post-polio's trio of manifestations.
Yes, that would be pain, weakness, and tiredness.
You also discuss how to deal with the repercussions of those manifestations. For example, you have chapters on exercise, weight control, difficulties with breathing and swallowing, even a chapter on falling.
All of those things are very important to those of us who have polio.
Drawing on your own polio experience and your 40-plus year career in internal medicine, you've written a book that's not only informative, but according to early reader response, it's also very easy to read and accessible.
Thank you. I love that. I love to hear that, because that's what I was trying to do with the book, was to make the science of polio more understandable to the polio patient, their caretakers, their physicians, and the general public. I'm glad that I seem to have accomplished that.
What is your take on the level of awareness, education, and understanding of post-polio in the healthcare community generally?
I think it's very inadequate. I think that can be explained in large part by the fact that the polio vaccine was so effective that since the early 70s, we have had essentially no active polio in the United States, and that's true in many other countries.
So, in other words, by the time post-polio was formally identified as a syndrome in 1984, the number of practitioners who were familiar with and experienced with polio was minimal.
It's correct. If you went to see a young physician now with complaints of post-polio, they would be recognized in all likelihood as a degenerative or arthritic problem or some other degenerative problem, not unlike those that he would be seeing in all of his other elderly patients. And so he would miss the diagnosis of polio, or wouldn't take it into consideration when he was treating the symptoms that you came in with.
If post-polio symptoms are similar to those degenerative symptoms experienced by the non-polio population, how much does it really matter whether the healthcare community is specifically aware of post-polio or not?
It matters tremendously. Although our symptoms or ailments may seem similar to our non-polio peers, they are actually very, very different. When we had polio, it left an imprint on all of our neuromuscular system, and consequently, every decision we make from a healthcare standpoint has to take into consideration our polio.
Can you give a couple of examples?
Yes, a post-polio patient going into surgery has a number of special problems regarding his respirations, his muscular activities, heart rate, and all of these are very important as far as his management is concerned during the surgical procedure. And it's our job to make the surgeon and the anesthesiologist aware of these problems. Another example would be just exercise. A physician who's unfamiliar with polio may inadvertently recommend more exercise or less exercise than we need. Either one can be a problem.
Do you think traveling without a spare can help raise the level of awareness and understanding of post-polio in the healthcare community?
I certainly hope so.
And when you set out to write this book, what was the main thing that you wanted your readers to take away from this?
I wanted them to become more knowledgeable about their disease, especially the science of their disease. I wanted them to have enough information so that they could advocate for themselves and also educate their healthcare providers as well as their physicians. It's interesting and surprising to me that we've had a number of people call back or come back and get a second copy of the book because they wanted it for their physician or other healthcare providers. This was very pleasant and encouraging to me.
That must make you very proud.
It really does.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's great. As a physician, what words of encouragement or advice do you have for other polio survivors who have to navigate the healthcare system?
Become informed about your own body and condition so that you can be a good partner with the members of your healthcare team. A good doctor will be delighted to have a well-informed patient who provides relevant information, raises important issues, and asks good questions. I really believe that as polio survivors, we need to help raise the level of awareness about post-polio.
Thank you very much, Dr. Leff. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
This has been Dr. Wenzel Leff talking to us about his new book, Traveling Without a Spare, A Survivor's Guide to Navigating the Post-Polio Journey.